He had been sitting alone for 2 hours. The wine he'd ordered was still full. The bread they'd brought was cold. And across the table, the chair he'd been staring at all night, empty. Some people in the restaurant were starting to look at him with that particular kind of pity that cuts worse than cruelty. Ethan Calloway was 32 years old, a widower, a father, and tonight, apparently, a man nobody wanted to show up for. He was reaching for his coat when she sat down. No warning, no apology. Just the sound of a chair scraping back and a woman who looked like she owned the room settling into it like she'd been invited. Like, comment your city below so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow along to the very end. The restaurant was called Linen and Salt, and it was the kind of place Ethan Calloway would never have picked for himself. It had exposed brick walls and Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling on black cords, and the menu was printed on thick cardstock that felt like it cost more than his electric bill. The tables were small and close together, which meant everyone in the room was already involved in everyone else's business, whether they intended to be or not. The couple 2 tables over was arguing about something in low, controlled voices that somehow carried anyway. The group near the window was celebrating a birthday and getting progressively louder about it. Somewhere behind him, a baby was trying and failing to keep quiet. Ethan had chosen the place because the woman he was supposed to meet had mentioned in their last message that she liked atmosphere. He had looked up what Linen and Salt charged for a glass of wine and almost backed out entirely. But he'd told himself he was doing this. He'd promised his sister he was doing this. He'd told his daughter's babysitter, a retired woman named Carla who lived 2 blocks over and charged by the hour, that he'd be back by 9, maybe 9:30 if things went well. It was now 8:47, and things had not gone well. Things had, in fact, not happened at all. The woman's name was Renee. He knew her from the app as a profile photo, a list of interests that included hiking and documentary films, and a string of texts that had been warm and genuinely funny. They had talked for almost 2 weeks before agreeing to meet. She was supposed to arrive at 7. Ethan had arrived at 6:55, because he was constitutionally incapable of being late to anything, and because he'd wanted a few minutes to breathe before she walked in. He'd been given a table for 2 near the back, close to the kitchen, and he'd ordered sparkling water, and looked at the menu without really reading it, and checked his phone 11 times in the first 15 minutes. By 7:15, he had sent 1 text. "Hey, I'm here. Table in the back. No rush." By 7:30, nothing. By 7:45, he had sent a second one. "Just making sure I have the right night. Still here if you're running late." That one had been read. The little check mark appeared and then nothing. By 8, the waiter, a young guy named Marcus, based on the name tag, had come by for the 3rd time with an expression of patient, professional sympathy that was somehow worse than outright pity. "Can I get you anything else, sir? Another sparkling water?" "I'm fine," Ethan had said. "She's just running a little late." Marcus had nodded in the way people nod when they know you're lying but are too polite to say so. Ethan had ordered a glass of Malbec at that point, mostly because he needed something to do with his hands and because $22 for wine suddenly seemed like a reasonable price to pay for the ability to look like a man who was simply enjoying a quiet drink rather than a man who had been stood up in a room full of people on a Thursday night. He didn't drink it. He thought about Lily instead. That's what he did when he needed something to hold on to. He thought about his daughter. She was 4 years old and had a laugh that sounded like bells, or at least that's how he thought of it. The private thought a parent keeps for himself because saying it out loud sounds embarrassing. She had her mother's nose and her mother's stubbornness, and she had recently decided that she would only eat macaroni and cheese if it was the kind that came from the blue box, not the fancy kind Ethan sometimes made from scratch, which she declared was wrong macaroni, with the absolute certainty of someone who has given the matter serious consideration. He had been doing this for 3 years, raising her alone, working from home because daycare didn't work with the deadlines, and the deadlines were the only thing keeping them in their apartment. He did freelance graphic design, logos, brand identities, the occasional website, and he was good at it, good enough that he had built a modest but stable client list without ever having to put on a suit or pitch himself in a room full of people. He was the kind of person who did excellent work quietly and then stepped back and watched someone else take the credit, which had irritated his late wife to no end. "You disappear," she had told him once. You make something beautiful and then you act like you had nothing to do with it. Her name had been Nora. She had died 26 months after they were married from a sudden cardiac event that the doctor said was caused by a heart defect none of them had known about. She was 30 years old. Lily was 14 months old. Ethan had been sitting in the waiting room of Austin General with a lukewarm cup of coffee and a half-eaten granola bar when the doctor came out to tell him. He did not think about that part anymore. Or rather, he had learned how to think around it, the way you learn to breathe around a bruised rib, carefully, shallowly, paying attention to the edges. His sister Rachel had been the one to suggest the dating app. "It's been 2 years," she'd said, which had been a few months ago when Lily was in the bathtub and they were sitting at Ethan's kitchen table talking around the subject of his life the way they always did. "You're not betraying anyone by being alive, Ethan. You're allowed to want something for yourself." He had resisted for weeks. He'd told himself it wasn't the right time, that Lily needed stability, that he didn't have the bandwidth, all of which was true, and also, he knew, beside the point. The real thing he didn't want to say out loud was that trying meant risking, and he had been emptied out by loss already, and he didn't know how much he had left to risk. But he had made the profile. He had agonized over the photos, 3 of them, all taken by Rachel at a family dinner 2 months ago, and written a description that his sister said was too understated, and he thought was honest. He had matched with several women, and had short, polite conversations that faded into nothing, and then he had matched with Renee, and the conversation had been different, more alive somehow. She was funny in a way that felt unguarded. She asked questions that were actually curious rather than procedural. She had mentioned, casually, that she still missed her childhood dog even though it had been 7 years, and something about that detail had made him trust her. He had told Lily he was going on a grown-up dinner. Lily had asked if she could come. He'd said no, it was for big people only. She'd thought about this and then said, "I'm a big people." He'd laughed and kissed her on the top of the head and felt a complicated tangle of feelings he couldn't name on the way to the restaurant. Now it was 8:54, and he had just looked at his phone for the last time. No messages. The previous one still showing as read, the small, deliberate cruelty of that small checkmark. He put the phone face down on the table and let himself feel the full weight of the evening for exactly 30 seconds. The empty chair, the untouched wine, the faint sound of Marcus somewhere behind him pretending not to watch. The birthday group getting louder near the window, the low hum of conversation from the dozens of people in this room who had all managed to show up for one another. He felt the humiliation of it. He let himself feel it, because that was the only way through, and then he folded it up and put it away. He reached for his coat. He was pulling it off the back of his chair, already mentally calculating how quickly he could get home and pay Carla and eat something standing over the kitchen sink when the chair across from him moved. Not fell. Not slid on its own. Someone pulled it back deliberately with a smooth, practiced motion and sat down in it. Ethan looked up. The woman who had just installed herself across from him was not Renee. He knew that immediately, and not only because he had been staring at Renee's profile photo for 2 weeks. This woman was different in almost every way. She was heavy-set, with the kind of confident posture that made her size something she occupied fully rather than apologized for. She was dressed in a way that said money. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the quieter kind that shows up in the cut of a blazer and the quality of a watch. Her hair was dark, pulled back from a round face with features that were sharp in the places that mattered, the eyes, especially. Brown and extremely direct, set under heavy brows that were expressive in a way she might not have intended. She was maybe 30, maybe a little older. Hard to tell because she had the slightly worn-looking confidence of someone who had already been through a few things. She set a small leather bag on the table, looked at him steadily, and said, without preamble, "You're Ethan Calloway." It was not a question. Ethan stared at her. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Vivian Mercer." She didn't offer her hand. "I own Mercer Hospitality Group. You don't know the name, but you've probably stayed in at least one of my hotels." She glanced at the untouched wine, then back at him. "Renee Chen works for me. She's been my assistant for 3 years." Ethan processed this. "Renee? From the app?" "Yes." "She works for you." "She does." He sat back slightly. Okay, why are you sitting at my table? Vivian looked at him for a moment as if she was deciding something. Then she said, because she's not coming, and I drove 40 minutes to tell you that in person rather than letting you sit here until 10 o'clock convincing yourself this was about you. There was something so blunt about it that Ethan didn't have an immediate response. He looked at her. He looked at the empty wine glass. He looked back at her. It's already almost 9, he said. I know, I got held up. She reached over and picked up the cardstock menu from the table. I'm ordering food. I haven't eaten since noon. She glanced up briefly. Do you mind? Ethan was still sitting with his coat half on. He looked at her for a long second. This stranger who had just sat down in the chair he'd been staring at for 2 hours and started reading his menu like she belonged there. And then slowly, without entirely knowing why, he took his coat off and put it back. Fine, he said. Tinta, Vivian ordered efficiently. Seared duck confit, no potato, extra greens. She asked Marcus whether the sauce was heavy, and he said it was light, and she said good, and handed back the menu without looking at it again. Then she folded her hands on the table and turned her attention back to Ethan, as if they'd been in the middle of a conversation. Renee panicked, she said. She gets in her head. She's been alone for a long time, and when something feels like it might actually matter, she tends to self-destruct the approach before she can be disappointed by the landing. Ethan absorbed this. She read my last text. I know, she showed it to me. That's a little involved. She called me crying in my car on the way home from an investor dinner, Vivian said flatly. Being involved wasn't optional. She paused. She wanted me to tell you she's sorry. She knows that doesn't fix a 2-hour wait, but she wanted you to know it wasn't about anything you said or did. How would she know that? Ethan said. She never met me. Vivian looked at him in a way that was almost curious. No, she said. That's fair. They sat in silence for a moment. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of two people who didn't know each other well enough to fill space with noise and weren't interested in pretending otherwise. Are you going to drink that? Vivian asked, nodding at the wine. Ethan pushed it toward her. Be my guest. She took it and drank a small amount, looked at the glass, nodded. Good choice. She set it back between them, not keeping it, just moving it out of the dead zone where he'd left it. Malbec? Yeah. From? I don't know. Marcus picked it. She almost smiled. Not quite. Her food arrived, and she ate with the focused efficiency of someone who was used to eating at odd hours and had long since stopped treating meals as social performance. Ethan sat across from her, not eating because he hadn't ordered anything, and watched her with a quiet curiosity he hadn't expected to feel tonight. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. You drove 40 minutes to come tell me this in person. I said that, yes. Why not just text? Renee had my number. Vivian set down her fork. She looked at him steadily. Because she'd been talking about this date for a week, she said, and because I know what it's like to sit across from an empty chair and not understand why. She picked up her fork again. And because I wanted to see what kind of man you were. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? She didn't answer immediately. She finished a bite, took a small sip of the wine, and set the glass back down. Renee showed me your profile, she said. I looked you up, your work, your portfolio. He went still. Why? Professional habit. When Renee talks about someone as much as she talked about you, I pay attention. She looked at him again with that direct, slightly unnerving attention. You designed the visual identity for the Hawthorne Collective last year. The logo suite, the full brand system. Yes. I almost hired that firm for a project we had going. The work was exceptional. Clean architecture, but warm, not precious. She tilted her head slightly. And then you did the rebrand for Collis and Marsh, the real estate firm. Their whole identity was generic before. The new mark you gave them it has memory, like it's been there a long time, even though it's new. Ethan stared at her. You looked at my portfolio. I'm a CEO, she said, not unkindly. I don't go places unprepared. That's somewhat invasive. Probably. She did almost smile again. But here we are. He studied her, The directness, the economy of it, the way she moved through a conversation like she was already 3 steps ahead and had decided to slow down and let you catch up as a courtesy. He had known people like that before, high functioning, always accelerating, but there was something different about her, something that had shown up in the admission about empty chairs. "You said you know what it's like," he said, "sitting across from one." She looked up from her plate. "Was that personal or professional?" he asked. She held his gaze. "Both," she said, and then, very deliberately, she changed the subject. Her name, he would later learn, meant something in the world she operated in. Mercer Hospitality Group was not a household brand in the way that some chains were, not the kind of name you saw on billboards on the highway or recognized from airport reward programs, but in the specific world of independent boutique hotels and curated hospitality experiences, Vivian Mercer was known. She had started the company at 24 with a single property, a neglected 19th century building in San Antonio that everyone told her was not viable, and which she had turned, through sheer calculated stubbornness, into a place that had a 4-month wait list within 18 months of opening. That was the origin story the industry liked. What they talked about less was what had come after. 6 years of grinding, compounding work, of acquiring properties that were structurally beautiful and operationally broken, of building a team and losing people and building it again, of making decisions in rooms where she was usually the youngest person and almost always the only woman, and very often the only person in the room with something to prove and nobody in the corner willing to prove it with her. She had 5 properties now, a 6th in development. Revenue that would have seemed like a fantasy to the version of her who had signed the papers on that first building at 24, with trembling hands that she'd held very still so the sellers couldn't see them shaking. She was 30 years old. She had been in 4 relationships in that time, none of them lasting longer than 8 months, all of them ending for variations of the same reason. She was too much, too focused, too consuming, too willing to cancel a Saturday dinner for a vendor crisis, too likely to answer her phone during a film, too constitutionally unable to be small enough for the space that was being offered to her. She had eventually stopped being surprised by the endings and started simply filing them away. Another data point. Another cost of the life she had chosen. What she had not filed away, and what she did not examine in the daylight very often, was the particular loneliness of building something significant and having no one to tell. Ethan did not know any of this yet. He only knew that this woman had driven 40 minutes to sit in an empty chair and tell him the truth about a stranger, and that something about the way she ate alone and changed the subject when it got personal made him think she had more practice at both than she let on. "The project you mentioned," he said, "for your company, the one you were going to hire a firm for." Vivian looked up. "What kind of project?" he asked. She was quiet for a beat. Then she set down her fork again, and this time she didn't pick it back up. "We're expanding," she said. 3 new properties over the next 18 months. Different markets, different aesthetics. One of them is going to be very different from anything we've done before. We've been operating with a visual identity that was right for where we started, but it's not right for where we're going." She paused. "We need a full rebrand, not a refresh, a reinvention." "That's a big project." "It's a very big project." Ethan leaned forward slightly, just slightly, because that's what happened to him when he got interested in a creative problem. He couldn't help it. The lean was involuntary. "How much of the existing identity do you want to preserve? Or are you starting clean?" Vivian looked at him, a long, assessing look. "Most firms I've talked to try to preserve too much," she said. "They want to honor the legacy, keep the continuity, not alienate the existing customer base." She picked up the wine glass. "I don't care about continuity for its own sake. I care about truth. I want the brand to be true to what the company actually is now, not what it was when I was 24 and scared and trying to convince people to take a chance on a building nobody else wanted." Ethan was quiet for a second. "That's harder than most clients are willing to say," he said. "I know. Most people, when you push on it, they actually do want the continuity. They want to feel brave, but land safe." "I know that too," she said. "I'm not most people." There was a silence. Outside on 6th Street, a car passed with its music up too loud. Marcus appeared briefly in Ethan's peripheral vision, checked something, and disappeared again. I'm a freelancer, Ethan said, not a firm. I know what you are. A project that size. I know the scope of my own project, Vivian said, not impatiently, evenly. I'm telling you about it because I looked at your work, and I think you understand something that most designers, firm or otherwise, don't understand. She set the wine glass down. You understand that a brand is a story, not a logo system, not a color palette, a story, and that the story has to be true or the whole thing falls apart eventually. She looked at him. The Hawthorne work told a story. The Collis and Marshmark told a story. They were honest. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You really did look at my portfolio, he said. I don't pay compliments I don't mean, she said. It wastes everyone's time. He was quiet again. He was thinking about the Hawthorne project, the months he had spent on it, the iterations he had thrown away, the version he had almost submitted before pulling it back at midnight the night before the presentation, because something in it was wrong, something was borrowed rather than found, and he had stayed up until 4 a.m. to find the right thing instead. He had never told the client that. He had delivered the work and watched them react and quietly put the story away. What would the timeline look like? He asked. Vivian looked at him. A small expression moved across her face, something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it, like a door opening an inch. That, she said, would depend on how seriously you're asking. I'm asking seriously. She was quiet for just a beat. Then she reached into the small leather bag she'd set on the table and produced a business card, an actual physical card, matte black with white text, minimal and clean, and set it on the table between them. Then call my office Monday morning, she said. My assistant will set something up. A real meeting, not a dinner. She glanced at the room briefly. Nothing against the place. The duck is actually excellent. Ethan picked up the card, looked at it, set it on the table in front of him. Why me? He asked. Not a firm. Not someone with a bigger footprint. Why would you want one person? Vivian considered this. Because a firm answers to its partners. A designer answers to the work. She looked at him. And because you made something called the Hawthorne Collective feel like it had always existed, like it grew out of the ground, and you did that with one mark and a type system and the right choice of 3 colors. She paused. I want someone who thinks that way, who feels the weight of what they're building. Ethan looked at the card again. And if I'm terrible in person, he said, if I show up Monday and you hate working with me? I don't make decisions based on first meetings, she said. I make them based on evidence. She had picked up her fork again and was finishing the last of her food. Your work is the evidence. The meeting is just a formality. He held the card. It had just her name, a phone number, and an email. No title, no logo, nothing decorative. You don't have your title on here, he said. Everyone who needs to know my title already knows it. She glanced up. And everyone who doesn't know it yet will find out. She left at 9:22. Not rudely, she asked for the check, paid for her food, and stood up with the same easy, occupying presence she'd arrived with, pulling on a light jacket that probably cost more than most people's car payments. She nodded at Ethan, brief but not dismissive. Monday morning, she said, before 10. My assistant logs calls after that. Got it. She looked at him for one more moment. It was the kind of look that made him feel like she was filing something away, not in a cold or transactional way, but in the way of someone who noticed things and kept them. Then she walked out through the front of the restaurant without looking back. Ethan sat at the table alone for a few minutes after she left. He looked at the business card. He looked at the glass of Malbec that had migrated back to the center of the table. He picked up the glass and finally drank from it. It was still good. A little warmer than it should have been, but still good. Marcus came by and asked if there was anything else. Ethan looked at the empty chair one more time. The one Renee was supposed to occupy, and then didn't, and then this other woman had occupied instead. This confident, self-contained, slightly unnerving woman who had driven 40 minutes to be honest with him and had spent half the time looking at him like she was reading something. Check, please, he said. He was home by 9:45. Carla was in the armchair in the living room with a library book, her reading glasses on and a cup of tea that had gone cold next to her. She looked up when he came in, then looked at the clock, then looked at him. The way women of a certain age look at you when they suspect something went either very well or very sideways. "Early," she said. "Yeah." "Good date?" Ethan considered this for a moment. He looked down at his coat pocket, where Vivian Mercer's card was. "Strange night," he said. Carla gave him a look that said she could pull the thread on that if she wanted to, but was choosing not to. She gathered her things. He paid her, walked her out, locked the door behind her. The apartment was quiet in the way it went quiet when Lily was asleep. Not empty, but settled, holding its breath around something small and essential. He stood in the kitchen for a while, drank a glass of water, looked at the business card again in the overhead light. Vivian Mercer. The letters clean and certain, like everything else about her. He thought about what she'd said, about the work, about story and truth and brands that lie because the people behind them are too afraid to be honest about what they've become. He thought about the Hawthorne Project and the night he'd pulled everything back and started over, the way he'd felt at 4 a.m. when it finally clicked into place. That specific exhausted certainty of knowing you'd found the true thing instead of the convenient thing. He set the card on the kitchen counter. He would call Monday. He already knew that. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing yet, standing in his kitchen in the 9 o'clock silence of his life, was that the woman who had sat down in the empty chair had made a decision of her own before she'd ever opened that restaurant door. That she'd reviewed his portfolio 3 times that afternoon while sitting in the back of a car. That the project was real and the timeline was real and the need was real, but that something else had brought her 40 minutes down the highway on a Thursday night to a restaurant she would never have chosen for herself. Something she wasn't ready to examine, wasn't sure she'd earned the right to examine, but which she'd driven toward anyway because Vivian Mercer had always moved toward difficult things before she was ready. He didn't know any of that, but the card was on the counter, and Monday was 3 days away. And somewhere down the hall, his daughter was sleeping, small and certain, with her mother's nose and her mother's stubbornness and an opinion about macaroni that would not be revised. Ethan turned off the kitchen light and went to check on her. She was on her side, one arm wrapped around a stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 8 months old, a worn, gray, floppy thing she called Pelly, with the absolute conviction of someone who had named a creature and expected the world to honor it. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He didn't think about the restaurant. He didn't think about Renee or the 2-hour wait or the humiliation of being the man everyone in the room had looked at with careful, sideways pity. He didn't think about the card on the counter or the meeting on Monday or the woman who had looked at him like she was reading something. He thought about Lily. Just Lily. Then he pulled the door almost closed, went to his own room, sat on the edge of his bed in the dark, and held the particular, complicated feeling of a night that had started as one thing and ended as something else entirely. Not better, not worse, just different, just unexpected. He lay back, stared at the ceiling. The empty chair had not been waiting for Renee. He couldn't have said why he thought that, only that when Vivian Mercer had sat down in it, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not like anything in a film where the music swells and, just quietly, privately, the way things shift when something that was wrong gets corrected and you only notice after the fact. He closed his eyes. Monday, he thought, before 10. He was already thinking about what he'd say. He called at 8:53 on Monday morning, not because he was anxious, or not only because of that, but because he had been awake since 6 and had spent the better part of 2 hours sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Vivian Mercer's card, turning it over in his fingers while Lily ate cereal and asked why the milk was making the O's soggy, and whether that was a problem. He'd told her it was not a problem. She'd considered this and eaten 3 more bites and then decided she was done. After he dropped her at preschool and walked back to the apartment, he sat down, looked at the card one more time, and dialed. The assistant who answered was efficient and pleasant in the specific polished way of people who manage powerful schedules. Warm enough to be human, brief enough to make clear that time was a resource being allocated, not given. She asked his name, confirmed the spelling, and put him on hold for less than 30 seconds before coming back to tell him Ms. Mercer had a slot open Wednesday at 2 o'clock if he was available. "I'm available," he said. "The address is on our website," she said. "Parking validation is available in the building garage. Bring a portfolio if you have something physical. She prefers to look at things in her hands." He thanked her and hung up. Then he sat for a moment with the phone on the table and thought, "She told her assistant I was going to call." He wasn't sure why that landed the way it did, only that it meant Vivian Mercer had come home Thursday night and at some point before the weekend was over had told someone to expect him, that she had been certain enough of his answer to prepare for it before he gave it. He opened his laptop and started pulling work. The Mercer hospitality offices were on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Austin that was newer than it looked. Deliberately so, built with materials that aged fast and well, the kind of architectural choice that costs more up front and communicates something quiet about the people inside. Ethan had been in a lot of corporate offices. Most of them felt like waiting rooms with better furniture. This one felt like someone had made actual decisions about what kind of place it should be. The reception area had a low ceiling with warm lighting and a single long bench made of reclaimed wood with thin cushions in a deep ochre color. There were no brand logos anywhere visible, no framed mission statements. One photograph on the wall, large and black and white, of a building he didn't recognize. Older, formal, with the worn quality of something that had survived several versions of itself. The receptionist was a young man in his mid-20s who offered Ethan water and meant it, which was rarer than it should have been. He waited 7 minutes. Vivian came out herself rather than sending someone. She was dressed differently than she had been Thursday. A structured blouse, dark trousers, her hair down this time, which changed something about her face, made her look less armored, not softer exactly, but more present. "Calloway," she said, the way someone says a name when they've been thinking it. She shook his hand, a real handshake, firm and brief. "Come on back." Her office was a corner room with windows on two sides, and the afternoon light was coming in at a low angle that made everything in the room look like it was made of something valuable. Her desk was a wide, clean surface with very little on it: a laptop, a coffee mug with the handle pointed away from her, a legal pad with notes he couldn't read from across the room. One wall had a large pinboard covered in images, clippings, and printed photographs. He recognized some of the properties. She sat behind the desk, and he sat across from it, and she looked at him for a second in that assessing way she had before nodding at the portfolio case he'd brought. "Show me," she said. So he showed her. He had spent Sunday evening editing the selection carefully, not trying to impress her with range or volume, which was the wrong instinct for this kind of meeting, but trying to show her a particular way of thinking. He had included the Hawthorne work and the Collis and Marsh identity. He had included 2 other projects she likely didn't know. He had also included one piece he had never shown a client, an exploratory concept he had developed for a hotel brand that had never been built. Something he'd worked on over several months a few years back purely because the problem had interested him, the way certain problems do when you're between projects and your mind needs something to chew on. He walked her through the work without overselling it. That was a thing he had learned early. The work either spoke or it didn't, and narrating it too hard was a way of confessing you didn't trust it. He talked about decisions. Why this typeface? Why this mark? What the color temperature was doing? What he was trying to make a person feel before they could articulate why they were feeling it. Vivian listened without interrupting, which was unusual. Most clients talked over the work, filled the silences with reactions, questions, objections. She looked and listened and only asked questions when he paused, and her questions were good. Not questions about preferences or whether he could change something, but questions about the architecture of the decisions. Why did you approach the negative space this way? What were you trying to resolve in that transition from the primary mark to the application system? When he got to the exploratory hotel concept, she stopped him. "This one wasn't for a client," she said. "No, you built this on your own." "When I had time." She looked at the printed boards he'd laid out on her desk. The concept was for a fictional brand he'd called Groundwork, a hospitality identity built around the idea of authentic local materials, nothing imported, nothing generic, every property an expression of the specific place it occupied. The visual language was spare and textural, with a typographic system that shifted slightly across applications in a way that suggested variation without losing coherence. "This is what you'd do if no one was paying you," Vivian said. It was not a question. Something like that. "Then this is the work I want you to do for me," she said. "Except someone will be paying you, substantially." She looked up from the boards. "Do you know our current brand identity? I looked at it over the weekend. What do you think?" He was careful here, not because he was being cautious, but because he wanted to be accurate. "I think it was right for where you were," he said. "The restraint, the neutrality, it reads as premium without committing to anything specific. That's smart when you're small and still proving yourself because it leaves room to be whatever the client needs you to be." He paused. "But you're not small anymore. And that same quality that read as premium now reads as careful, like the company is still hedging." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me about it," she said. "The firms I talked to kept calling it clean, saying it had strong bones." "It does have strong bones. But bones aren't a personality." She sat back. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, more like recognition, like he'd named a thing she'd already known but hadn't heard stated plainly. "Okay," she said. "Here's what I'm proposing. I want you on this project as creative director for the rebrand. Full scope. Brand identity, visual language, application systems, everything from the digital presence to the physical experience materials. We have 3 new properties in development, one in Charleston, one in Denver, one in Portland. Different markets, different histories, different clientele. I want an identity system that's coherent enough to hold them all together, but flexible enough that each property still feels like it belongs where it is." Ethan looked at her. "That's a very big project for one person. You'd have resources. I have an internal team, 2 designers and a marketing director who is good at execution, if not at concept. You'd lead the concept work and direct the execution." She paused. "I also want you traveling with me to the properties. I want you to see them before you start drawing. A brand that doesn't know where it lives is just decoration." "Traveling when?" "The Charleston property is the furthest along. I'm going in 3 weeks for a walkthrough and some infrastructure meetings. I'd want you there for 2 days. Ethan thought about Lily. His expression must have shifted without his entirely meaning it to, because Vivian said, without any particular emphasis, "I know you have a daughter. Renee mentioned it. The travel would be planned in advance and wouldn't exceed 4 or 5 days at a stretch. We're not asking you to relocate." He looked at her. "Renee told you." "She was thorough in her description of you," Vivian said, without any particular inflection. "She felt guilty." "She still works for you?" "Of course. It was a personal situation, not a professional one. I don't manage people's private lives." She looked at him steadily. "Any of them." The implication was clear and not uncomfortable. He appreciated the clarity of it. "I'd need a few things settled before I committed," he said. "The contract structure, the IP ownership, standard creative director agreement," she said. "IP transfers on delivery with a licensing provision for derivative use. You retain portfolio rights. My legal team drafted it last week." She slid a folder across the desk. "You can take it with you. Have someone look at it if you want. The rate is on page 2. He opened the folder to page 2. He looked at the number for a moment without reacting, which took some effort. "That's," he started. "It reflects the scope," Vivian said, "and the timeline, and the fact that I looked at your portfolio 3 times on Thursday before I drove to that restaurant." He looked up. 3 times. "Mom, I was thorough," she said, and she almost smiled again. That same almost, the door opening an inch. Ethan looked back at the folder. He thought about the freelance calendar he'd cleared to accommodate this, which wasn't as full as he'd have liked it to be. He thought about the exploratory hotel concept sitting in his portfolio, the thing he'd built for no one, because the problem had mattered to him. He thought about what she'd said at dinner about brands and stories and honesty. "I'm not going to tell you I'm not interested," he said. "I know. I just want to do this right. I want to understand what you actually need versus what you think you want, and those are sometimes different things." "I know that too." And if I come to you 3 months in and tell you we need to change direction because something isn't working, then I want you to tell me 3 months in, Vivian said, not 6 months in, not after we've printed 100,000 pieces of collateral. She looked at him. I hired firms before because I thought the size of the team would make the work safer. It didn't. It just made it slower to be wrong. There was a beat of quiet. I'll read the contract, Ethan said. Good. He began to stack the portfolio boards back into his case, and she stood from behind the desk in the way she had of moving, not rushing, just deciding a thing was complete and acting on it. She came around and stood near the pinboard wall, and he noticed for the first time how she looked at the images on it, not with the detached scrutiny of a business person reviewing assets, but with something quieter, like they meant something to her beyond the balance sheet. Which one is the Portland property? He asked. She pointed without hesitation to a photograph near the top left, a low, horizontal building with a moss-colored roof, surrounded on 3 sides by tall Douglas firs that dwarfed the structure. It looked old, not run down, but old in the way of things that had earned their age. What was it before? A private hunting lodge built in 1923. The family who owned it sold it to a timber company. The timber company sold it to a developer. The developer went bankrupt and it sat for 11 years. She looked at the photograph. The bones are extraordinary. The infrastructure is a disaster. What do you want it to feel like when it's done? She was quiet for a moment. Like you found it, she said. Like it was always there in the trees and you just didn't know where to look. Ethan looked at the photograph. He looked at the image of the moss-covered roof and the density of the trees and the way the building seemed to press itself into the ground like it was trying to belong to the landscape. He felt the thing he always felt when a problem was real, a quiet pull, like something clicking to attention. He picked up his portfolio case. I'll call you Thursday, he said, after I've read this. Vivian nodded. She walked him out herself, which she didn't have to do, and at the door she said nothing further. Just nodded once more, the way she'd nodded at Linen and Salt, brief but not dismissive. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. He stood there with the contract folder under his arm and thought about the Portland property and a hunting lodge that had waited 11 years in the trees. He was already working on it in the back of his mind. He couldn't help it. That was always how it started. He called her Thursday morning and said yes. She said good, and asked if he could start the following Monday, and he said yes to that too. She said her assistant would send over the onboarding details and the project brief, and to feel free to ask questions if anything in the brief was unclear, because she had written it herself and was aware that she sometimes compressed information when she was impatient. It was the first personal thing she had admitted to him in a non-face-to-face context. He wrote it down. The following 3 weeks moved differently than the weeks before them had moved. Ethan's life had developed a particular rhythm over the 3 years of being alone. The school drop-offs and pickups, the work hours carved out of nap time and evenings, the freelance deadlines and invoices, and the low-grade financial anxiety that was always present like a sound just below the range of hearing. The rhythm had become familiar enough that he'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a piece of furniture in a room you walk through every day. Working with Mercer Hospitality disrupted the rhythm, but not badly. He came into their offices 3 days a week and worked from home the other 2. The internal design team, 2 people named Priya and Dale, both in their late 20s, and both good in ways that were different from each other, turned out to be receptive in the way that competent people are when they've been waiting for someone to give them something worth doing. Dale was technically better than he let on and had a bad habit of defaulting to safe choices when he wasn't being pushed. Priya was fast and conceptually sharp, but lost confidence when the direction wasn't clear and sometimes needed to be told she was on the right track because nobody else was telling her. Ethan had worked with people long enough to read these things and adjust. The marketing director was a man named Greg Harmon who wore expensive sneakers and said things like, aligned on that, and circle back, with the regularity of someone who had been in too many corporate meetings and absorbed the language like a sponge absorbs whatever it's sitting in. Greg was competent in his lane and somewhat protective of his territory, and he and Ethan had a few early conversations that were careful in the specific way of conversations between 2 people, establishing whose authority ends where. Vivian watched this without intervening, which told Ethan something. The first time they had a genuine conflict, over whether the rebrand rollout timeline should be driven by the Charleston opening or built around a broader media moment that Greg was pursuing. Vivian sat in the room and let them talk. She let it run longer than was comfortable. Then she said quietly, "What would serve the brand, not the calendar?" And that was the end of it. He started to understand her management style in those weeks. She was not the kind of leader who made decisions by committee or who softened feedback to protect feelings or who used ambiguity as a power tool. She was direct, and she expected directness in return, and she was willing to be wrong as long as being wrong happened in the service of getting to right. She ran meetings the way she did everything, efficiently, without ceremony, with an attention to the thing that actually needed solving rather than the performance of solving it. She also had a particular quality that he hadn't expected. She listened. Not the performative listening of executives who are formulating their response while you're still talking, but actual listening. The kind where you can feel the other person holding your words long enough to see if they're true. It made conversations with her feel more serious than conversations usually were, which was sometimes uncomfortable and always clarifying. They were not personal with each other in those first weeks. They were professional in the way of two people who have enough mutual respect to keep things clean while the work gets established. But there were small things that accumulated. She brought coffee to their one-on-ones without asking how he took it, because on his first day she had watched him make himself a cup in the office kitchen and noted it. He didn't comment on this because doing so would have made it strange. He simply drank the coffee and moved on. She asked about his daughter exactly once in the office, on a Wednesday afternoon when he mentioned offhand that he'd be leaving at 4 because of a school thing. "What's her name?" Vivian asked. He said Lily. She said that was a good name, said it the way you say something when you actually think it rather than when you're being polite, and went back to the brief they'd been reviewing. He noticed that she worked late most nights and ate dinner at her desk with the same focused efficiency with which she ate everything. He noticed that she did not have photographs in her office, not on her desk, not on the walls, nothing personal that would tell you anything about who she was outside this room. He noticed that the one photograph in the reception area, the black and white building image, was the exterior of the San Antonio property, the first one, the one she had bet everything on at 24. He noticed these things and added them to a picture that was still mostly incomplete. Whoa. 3 weeks after he signed the contract, he was in Charleston. The property was a former textile warehouse on the edge of the historic district. 3 stories of original brick with iron window frames that had oxidized to a deep reddish-brown and wide plank floors that had been treated but not replaced, so they still bore the divots and stains of 100 years of industrial use. It was in the middle of a renovation that was running slightly behind schedule, which Vivian had mentioned without apparent distress on the flight down, which had told him something about her relationship with imperfect progress. They walked the building with the site manager, a compact, humorless woman named Trish, who communicated primarily in timelines and square footage and clearly respected Vivian in the way of someone who has watched a person make good decisions under pressure and adjusted accordingly. Vivian asked precise questions and took notes on her phone and moved through the space without the tentative quality that some people bring to buildings that aren't finished. The slight apologetic crouch, the careful stepping around of tools and materials. She moved as if she already knew what the building was going to be. Ethan trailed slightly. He did what he always did in a new space. He looked at things that most people didn't think to look at. He looked at the transitions, where one material met another, where old became new, where the building had been changed by time in ways that were honest rather than repaired. He photographed things that would not have made sense to Trish or to the contractor who passed through behind them. A water stain on the south-facing brick that had created a gradation of color from dark amber at the top to pale ochre at the base. The iron window frames and the particular quality of light they cast in the late afternoon, warm and slightly industrial, like something that belonged to the last century, was illuminating the present one. A section of original flooring where someone, decades ago, had stenciled a small compass rose near a loading dock, barely visible now under layers of finish. Vivian caught him photographing the compass rose and stopped. "What's that for?" she asked. "Not sure yet," he said. "Maybe nothing." She looked at it, then she looked at him. "You're the first person who's noticed that in 3 walkthroughs. The foreman probably stepped over it every day." "Probably." She looked at the rose again. My grandmother had a compass. She used to say that knowing where north is doesn't tell you where to go. It just means you can't pretend you're lost. She said it without inflection, the way people say personal things when they're looking at something else and the guard comes down because attention is elsewhere. Ethan said nothing for a moment. "That's a good line for a brand," he said carefully. Vivian looked at him. Something moved across her face. Amusement, maybe, or the trace of it. "Don't put my grandmother in your marketing." "Noted." They moved on, but he wrote it down that night in the small notebook he carried that was not for work exactly. More for the raw material of work, the things that might matter and might not. Knowing where north is doesn't tell you where to go. They had dinner that evening at a low-key place a few blocks from the hotel where the team was staying, a group of 5 including Trish and one of the contractors. The conversation was mostly work, scheduling, materials, a budget disagreement that Vivian resolved in 4 sentences without raising her voice. Ethan sat across from her and watched her navigate the table dynamic with the same ease she brought to everything, comfortable with authority but not performing it, direct without being aggressive, occasionally funny in a dry, unexpected way that caught people off guard because they hadn't braced for it. At one point, around dessert, the contractor made a joke about long hours that was also, if you were paying attention, a gentle complaint about the schedule. Vivian let it land. Then she looked at him and said, "I know it's a lot. You're doing good work. I notice it." Just that. No caveats, no pivot to urgency. The contractor nodded and the table moved on, but Ethan had watched the man's posture shift after she said it. The particular relaxation of someone who has been carrying something and had it briefly acknowledged. She knew what that cost people, he thought. She knew what it meant for someone to feel seen. On the walk back to the hotel, the group drifted apart naturally, and Ethan and Vivian ended up walking the last block alone. The evening was warm and heavy with the coastal air that Charleston did differently than Austin. Thicker, slower, salt-edged. Their footsteps on the brick sidewalk were the main sound. "Good day," he said. "Productive," she said, which was her version of agreeing. "The building is remarkable." "I know." A pause. "You found the compass rose." "It was there to find." She was quiet for a moment. They were almost at the hotel entrance. "My team doesn't usually notice things like that," she said. "They're looking at the structure, the systems. What needs to be fixed?" She glanced at him briefly. "You were looking at what's already there." "That's the job," he said. "You can't find the story if you don't look for what the place is already saying." She stopped at the door. The light above the entrance caught her face. The directness. The weight behind it. "That's what I needed you here for," she said. It wasn't a personal statement. It was professional and precise and clearly meant as exactly what it said. But something in the way she said it was slightly different from the way she said things in the office. Quieter, the efficiency less present, something less managed. He held the door. She walked through. They said goodnight in the lobby and took the elevator to separate floors, and Ethan stood in his room for a moment with his jacket still on, looking out at the lights over the harbor, thinking about compass roses and inherited lines that told you what direction meant without telling you where to go. He was not thinking about her. Or he was telling himself he wasn't, which was not the same thing. He opened his notebook. He wrote for an hour and a half. When he finally stopped, the page was full of things that were the beginning of something. Not finished, not ready, but present. Alive in the way that early work is alive, fragile in particular, not yet hardened into a decision. He closed the notebook and lay back on the unfamiliar bed and looked at the unfamiliar ceiling. Charleston was a good city, he thought. It kept its age on its surface and didn't apologize for it. There was something there. There was something in all of it. He just needed to find the shape of it. He turned off the light. The rebrand presentation happened on a Tuesday in October in the main conference room on the 14th floor, with 12 people around the table and several more dialed in remotely. Ethan had been preparing for 6 weeks. Not the anxious circular kind of preparation that comes from uncertainty, but the deep, methodical kind that comes from having found the true thing and needing to communicate it clearly enough that other people could see it too. He had gone through 11 versions of the core mark before landing on the one that felt right. He had thrown out an entire color system in week 4 because Priya had put 2 of the options side by side on a printed sample, and something in the combination was wrong. Not technically wrong, but wrong in the way that things are wrong when they're lying about what they are. He had started over. Dale had stayed late 2 nights running without being asked. The work was good. Ethan knew it was good the way you know it when you stop second-guessing and start defending. When the logic of every decision is so clear to you that you can explain it without preparation because you didn't invent it, you found it. The new identity was built around a concept he had landed on the night in Charleston. Sitting with his notebook and the image of the compass, rose, and the words Vivian's grandmother had said about knowing where north was. The visual language was grounded in the idea of orientation, not direction, not destination, but the quiet confidence of knowing exactly where you stand. The primary mark was a form that read differently at different scales. Close up, it was structural, geometric, precise. At distance, it resolved into something warmer, like a handprint or a hearth. It worked across all 3 properties without being identical at any of them, because Ethan had built the system to flex around the character of each place rather than stamp a uniform identity over it. He had been nervous about explaining this to 12 people who might not have the vocabulary for it. He was not nervous about explaining it to Vivian. She sat at the end of the table and did what she always did. She listened without interrupting and asked questions only at the natural breaks, and kept her face composed in a way that gave nothing away to anyone watching from the outside. But Ethan had been in enough rooms with her by now to read the smaller signals. The way she leaned forward slightly when something interested her, the particular quality of her stillness when she was thinking hard, the single small movement of her thumb against the edge of the table when something landed. Her thumb moved 3 times during the presentation. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment in the specific way of rooms where something has gone well and people are catching up to it. Greg Harmon said the work was strong and on brand, both of which were true and both of which were also the safest possible responses. And Ethan was grateful for them because Greg had been skeptical of the direction in week 3 and had come around without making a production of it. One of the remote attendees, a senior investor whose voice through the conference speaker had the slightly compressed authority of someone who is used to being the most expensive person in the room, asked 2 careful questions about the rollout timeline and the production budget for the application systems. Vivian answered both without referring to notes. Then she looked at Ethan. "This is it," she said. Just those 3 words in the room to everyone. An absolute statement, not a question and not a proposal. The kind of declaration that ends a long search. The weeks after the presentation moved fast and strange. The way time moves when you're working at the edge of what you can do and the outcome actually matters. Production ramped up. Priya and Dale were running on the application rollout while Ethan managed the direction and handled the pieces that needed to be built rather than executed. The Charleston property was 3 months from soft opening. Denver was 4 months behind that. Portland, with its complicated infrastructure and its moss-covered roof and its 11 years of waiting in the trees, was still a year out. He was in the office more than he had been, and some of those days ran late. He had renegotiated his arrangement with Carla, additional hours, additional pay, which was manageable now in a way it hadn't been 6 months ago. And he had sat down with Lily and explained in terms a 4-year-old could hold that Daddy had a big project and some nights he would be home later, but he would always be home. Lily had processed this and asked whether the project was good important or boring important. He'd thought about that. "Both," he said. She'd nodded, satisfied. Then she'd asked if she could have the blue box macaroni for dinner. He and Vivian developed a rhythm. Tuesday mornings were the formal check-in with the full team, but there were smaller check-ins, quick calls, a run of messages on a shared channel that was supposed to be for project updates, and had, over time, developed a slightly different quality, more direct, occasionally dry. Once, at 11:30 on a Thursday night, she sent him a photograph of a wallpaper sample with the message, "This is what the interior team proposed for the Charleston entry. Tell me I'm not wrong to hate it." He had looked at it, a complicated floral pattern that was historically accurate and completely wrong for what the space was trying to say, and typed back, "You are not wrong." She had responded with a single word, "Thank you." Then, "Get some sleep." He had sat with his phone for a moment after that, in the half-dark of his kitchen, and noticed that something in him was warmer than it should have been from a work exchange about wallpaper. He put the phone down. He went to bed. He did not examine it, the way he had learned not to examine certain things before he was ready to deal with them. The Denver trip was in late November. 2 days, a contractor walkthrough, a community meeting with the neighborhood association that was required as part of the permit process. The property was a former railroad hotel in the Five Points neighborhood, built in 1907, with a grand lobby that had been subdivided at some point in the 1960s into smaller rooms and a facade that had been covered in panels of textured aluminum that looked like a decision made by someone who had lost an argument. Ethan arrived the evening before the meetings. Vivian arrived that same evening. Later, her flight from a board meeting in San Francisco had been delayed, and she came into the lobby of the hotel where they were staying carrying her bag and looking like someone who had been on 3 planes in 2 days and was functioning on infrastructure alone. He was at the bar having a beer when she walked through. She saw him, changed her direction, and sat on the stool beside him without ceremony. "Delayed," she said. "I figured." "Do they still have food?" The bartender materialized, and she ordered something hot and a glass of wine and sat with her elbows on the bar in a posture that was, for Vivian Mercer, the equivalent of lying down. She had her jacket off. Her hair was loose, which it almost never was in the office. She looked tired in a specific way, not depleted, but stripped of the extra layers she usually carried. "How was San Francisco?" he asked. "Fine. Our lead investor wants to accelerate the Portland timeline. I told him the building wasn't ready, and he told me timelines were flexible, and I told him concrete wasn't." She picked up her wine. "We agreed to disagree, politely." "You're sure you held the line?" "I held the line. Because Greg mentioned, Greg doesn't speak for my decisions," she said, without heat. "I know what he mentioned. I know he thinks we should move faster. Greg thinks everything should move faster because he believes speed is a proxy for momentum." She looked at her wine. "It's not. Momentum is a product of direction. Speed without direction is just noise." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's a good distinction." "It's an obvious one. Most people just don't slow down long enough to make it." She looked at him sideways briefly. "You already knew that. You held the Denver mark for 8 days before you submitted it to the team. I noticed." He had held it for 8 days because something in the letter spacing of the application variant had been half a degree wrong in a way that no one would likely notice until it was printed at large scale, at which point it would have been quietly wrong forever. He had found it on day 6 and fixed it on day 8. "I didn't know you were counting," he said. "I count a lot of things I don't announce." She said it simply, not pointedly. She got her food and ate with the same focused economy as always, but slower tonight. More like a person eating, less like a schedule being managed. He ordered another beer and they sat for a while in the comfortable quiet that had developed between them over the months. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have said enough real things to each other that empty space doesn't feel like a problem to be solved. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ethan said. She looked at him. "You can ask?" "The no photographs in your office." She waited. "That's deliberate, right? Not just minimalist taste." She was quiet for a moment. "You're observant." "I look at things." "Yes, you do." She turned the wine glass a quarter turn on the bar. "The office is a workspace," she said finally. "What I put in it should serve the work. Personal photographs are for people who need to be reminded of their life while they're at work." She paused. "I don't need reminding. Or you don't want the people across the table from you reading it," he said. She looked at him. A long look. "Both," she said. It was the same word he'd used with Lily. He sat with that for a moment. "Is there a photograph you would put there, if you weren't being strategic about it?" She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, without looking at him, "My mother and me when I was 7, we were at the beach. I don't remember which one. She was laughing at something I'd said, and I was looking at the camera, and I looked. Very serious. Very convinced of something." She almost smiled. "She died when I was 12. I only have 4 photographs of her." He did not say he was sorry because she hadn't said it to receive condolence. She'd said it because he'd asked, and she'd chosen to answer. "4's not nothing," he said. No, she agreed. It's not nothing. They sat at the bar for another 40 minutes after that. They talked about the Denver property, what the neighborhood meeting would need, what the community had historically been promised by developers who hadn't followed through, how to communicate something true rather than something marketable. They talked about Portland, the photograph on the pinboard, the way the trees were going to shape what the property could become. At some point around midnight, the bar got quieter. Vivian had finished her food and was on her second glass of wine, which was unusual for her, and there was something different about her at this hour. The armor still present, but worn loosely, like a coat you've unbuttoned and haven't bothered to take off. "I want to say something," she said, not looking at him. "Okay." "I didn't come to Linen and Salt just because of Renee." He had known this in some part of himself since the night it happened, but hearing it stated plainly was different from knowing it. He held it for a second. "I know," he said. She turned to look at him. "I came because of the portfolio, because I wanted to see what kind of person made work like that, whether the person matched the work." She held his gaze. "I'm not in the habit of explaining my decisions, but that one, I want you to understand it wasn't manipulation. I had a real project and a real professional interest, and those were both true, but they weren't the only reason." He looked at her. In the low light of the bar, with her hair down and the armor loosened, she looked younger and older at the same time. Younger in the openness, older in the knowledge of what openness costs. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Because we're going to be working together for at least another year," she said. "And because things have been developing a quality that I don't want to let go unacknowledged and then have it become something we're both managing around without naming it." She turned the glass again. "That's worse. The unacknowledged version is worse." He thought about the late-night wallpaper message, the coffee she'd noted without asking, the way she'd said, "This is what I needed you here for on the Charleston sidewalk," the thumb moving against the table edge. "Are you telling me you have feelings for me?" he said. "Or are you telling me you've noticed that I might have them for you?" She looked at him for a long moment. "A real one." "I'm telling you both of those things are true," she said, "and that I don't know what to do with them professionally." "Neither do I," he said honestly. "Good." She finished her wine. "Then we're equal." That's one way to put it. She set the glass down. She stood up and put her jacket back on, and for a moment she was Vivian Mercer, the CEO again, composed, self-contained, the coat back on and buttoned. But not quite all the way. Something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and they both knew it, and it sat in the space between them with a particular weight that was not comfortable and not uncomfortable, but simply real. "Good night, Calloway," she said. "Good night," he said. She walked away through the quiet bar. He sat with his mostly finished beer and stared at the rows of bottles behind the counter and thought about 4 photographs and a woman laughing at the beach and a little girl looking at the camera with the total conviction of someone who already understood something important. They did not talk about it on the Denver trip. They were professional for 2 days. The contractor walk, the neighborhood meeting, a tense exchange with a city planning official about the permit timeline that Vivian resolved with a combination of data and polite immovability that Ethan had come to recognize as her characteristic mode under pressure. They worked. They were good at working together, and they both knew it, and for 2 days they let that be enough. On the flight back to Austin, they sat next to each other, assigned seating, no choice, and for the first hour they both had their laptops open and were ostensibly working. He was refining the secondary type system for the Denver application materials. She was reviewing something on her screen that he couldn't see and occasionally making marks on a printed document. At some point over New Mexico, she fell asleep. It happened the way it happens on planes when someone hasn't slept enough, and the altitude and the low hum of the engines do their work. Not dramatically, just gradually, the head tilting slightly, the documents going still. Her hand was on the armrest between them, loosely open. Ethan glanced at her. He looked back at his screen. He did not look at her again because that would have been a thing he was doing, and he was not ready to be a person who did that thing yet. But he was aware of her, the warmth of proximity, the specific and quiet intimacy of being the person awake beside someone sleeping, the small, accidental trust of it. He closed his laptop. He looked out the window at the flat brown geography 35,000 feet below. He thought about Nora. He did this sometimes. Not the dark version, not the waiting room version, but the ordinary version. The way she had stood at the kitchen counter every morning drinking tea with the bag still in, which had been a habit he'd found inexplicable and had never once objected to. The way she used to fall asleep on planes too, with the same absolute efficiency, as if she had decided sleep was happening and made it so. He thought about how she would have read Vivian. She would have liked her. He knew that with the certainty you sometimes have about things you can't verify, the kind of knowing that isn't about evidence. You disappear, Nora had told him. You make something beautiful and then you act like you had nothing to do with it. He had been disappearing for 3 years, not dramatically. He had kept himself present for Lily, had kept the work going, had kept the routine running, but the part of him that wanted things for himself, that believed he deserved to want them, had gone quiet. He had let it go quiet because letting it go quiet was easier than the alternative. He was not sure when the alternative had started feeling possible again. He thought it might have been a Thursday night in a restaurant on 6th Street, when a chair scraped back and a woman sat down in it like she'd been invited. He was still sitting with that thought when Vivian woke up. Not gradually, the way she'd gone under, but suddenly, the way she did everything. She sat up straight, looked around for a half second to place herself, then looked at him. I slept, she said. It came out slightly surprised. For about 40 minutes. She straightened, pulled her composure back around her with the ease of long practice. Ethan, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. In the office, it was always Calloway. Not unfriendly, just efficient, the way she used last names with people she respected, which he had noticed early on. He looked at her. I want to try, she said. I don't know how, and I have no good model for this, and my track record in personal things is not encouraging. She said it plainly, not self-deprecating, just true. But I want to try. He looked at her for a long moment. The plane hummed. Below them, the Texas landscape appeared at the edge of the window, the low, flat, sun-worn ground that meant they were almost home. My daughter thinks she's a big people, he said. Vivian blinked. What? She told me she's a big people. When I said a date was for grown-ups only. He paused. She's 4. She has opinions about macaroni, and she calls her stuffed elephant Pelly, and she will ask you direct questions about things you thought you had carefully not mentioned. He looked at Vivian steadily. I'm telling you because she's not something I navigate around. She's the center of the thing. Vivian met his eyes. I know that. I don't mean it as a warning. I know, she said again. I know what you mean. A pause. I'm not good at this. I want to be clear about that. I don't have a roadmap, and I'll probably be bad at the soft parts, and work will still be work, and I will not apologize for what the company needs from me. She looked at him with the same directness she brought to everything. But I want to try. He felt something move in his chest, not the dramatic kind. Nothing cinematic. Just a small internal shift, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for too long. Just air coming in. Then we'll try, he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression changed, not softening exactly, more like a particular tension releasing, the one she had been carrying since that bar in Denver, maybe longer. Okay, she said. She picked up her printed document. He opened his laptop. They flew the rest of the way home in the familiar, productive quiet, shoulders almost touching, both of them working, neither of them performing the new thing they'd just agreed to, just letting it exist, quietly, alongside everything else. The wheels touched down in Austin at 6:42 in the evening. Carla had Lily fed and bathed and in pajamas when he got home. Lily ran at him from the hallway with the full-body commitment of someone who has not seen a person in 2 days and intends them to know it. He caught her. She smelled like the watermelon shampoo he bought from the kids' aisle at the pharmacy. She said his name twice. Daddy, Daddy, like she needed to say it the second time to make sure it stuck. He held her and looked at his apartment, the slightly worn couch, and the stack of picture books on the coffee table, and the blue box macaroni box on the counter that Carla had thoughtfully left visible as a hint. He held Lily and thought, I am trying to build something new. That is allowed. That is what comes next. It was not a resolution. He knew that. It was a beginning, which was different, messier, less certain, contingent on 100 things he couldn't control, but it was alive, and alive was better than safe. He put Lily down and made the blue box macaroni and let her watch an extra 30 minutes of her show because he was home and she was happy, and some nights that was reason enough. He did not text Vivian that night. She did not text him. But somewhere across the city, he was almost certain she was awake at her desk, in the room without photographs, working on the thing they were both building, and maybe, for the first time, holding something alongside the work that wasn't just the work. He hoped so. He thought she was. The story broke on a Wednesday morning in January, 6 weeks after the flight back from Denver. Ethan found out the way most people find out about things they'd rather not know, from someone else's phone. He was in the office kitchen making coffee when Dale came in with his screen already turned toward him, expression caught somewhere between uncomfortable and braced. "You should probably see this," Dale said. It was a post on an industry gossip account that had somewhere between 40 and 60,000 followers. Enough to matter, not enough to be mainstream, but in the specific world of hospitality and design, it was read by exactly the people whose opinions affected exactly the things Ethan and Vivian had been building. The post was 3 paragraphs and a photograph. The photograph was from the Denver hotel bar, taken from a distance, slightly blurred, the kind of image that required a moment to parse, and then became, once parsed, impossible to unsee. 2 people at a bar, late at night, her with the wine, him with the beer, heads inclined toward each other. The caption read, "Sources close to Mercer Hospitality confirm the CEO's creative director hire has expanded beyond brand consulting. Question is, which came first, the job or the personal relationship? And who else in the company knew?" Ethan looked at the image for a long moment. "How long has this been up?" he asked. "Since last night," Dale said. "It started getting reshared this morning." Ethan set down his coffee mug. He pulled out his phone. There were 3 messages from Vivian, all in the last 20 minutes, that said, in ascending brevity, "I'm aware. Don't respond to anything. Come to my office." He went. She was standing when he arrived, not behind her desk, but in front of the window, phone in hand, looking at the city the way you look at something when you're too angry to sit down. Her assistant, a new one, Renee had taken a different position within the company 3 months prior, was hovering near the door with the expression of someone waiting for a grenade to land. "Leave us," Vivian said. The assistant vanished. She turned around. Her face was controlled, but barely. There was something in the set of her jaw that Ethan had not seen before, a tightness that went beyond the professional. "You saw it," she said. "Dale showed me." "Have you responded to anything?" "No, I don't have your followers. I don't think anyone's coming to me." She turned back to the window briefly, then turned again, like she needed the movement. "The photograph is from Denver. Someone in that bar took it and held it for a month and a half and then sold it or shared it or... It doesn't matter how. It's out." "Who are the sources?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Could be anyone. Could be someone who recognized us and extrapolated. Could be something internal." She paused on that word in a way that told him it hurt. "My legal team is on it. The PR firm is on standby." She looked at him directly. "The problem is not the photograph. 2 people sitting at a bar is not a scandal. The problem is the framing, that I hired you because of a personal relationship and dressed it up as a professional one. That's not what happened." "I know that." Her voice was sharp. "I'm telling you what they're implying. I'm telling you that there are people in this industry who have been waiting for a reason to reframe my success as something other than competence, and this hands them a narrative that is just credible enough to do damage." He sat down in the chair across from her desk, which she hadn't offered because they had long since passed the stage of waiting for those kinds of formalities. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "My PR firm wants to say nothing. Standard protocol. Don't feed it. Let it die." She was quiet for a beat. "My instinct is that saying nothing in this case reads as guilty, the kind of nothing that confirms the story by not denying it. So you want to respond." "I want to tell the truth," she said, "which is that I identified your work before I met you in person, that the project brief existed before I ever walked into that restaurant, that every professional decision was made on merit and can be demonstrated as such." She paused. "And that, yes, something personal developed after you were hired, and that is our business, not theirs, but Not something I'm willing to pretend didn't happen. Ethan looked at her. You want to confirm the relationship. I want to stop letting other people write the story of it. She looked at him with the same directness she'd had in a hotel bar in Denver when she'd said, I want to try. This company is mine. I built it from a building nobody wanted. I'm not going to let some anonymous photograph reframe 12 years of work into a story about a woman who hired her boyfriend. She paused. But I'm also not going to lie about who you are to me. I don't do that. He held her gaze. He thought about what telling the truth publicly would cost, not just professionally, but personally. The scrutiny, the way the story would be held and turned over by people who didn't know them, who would fit it into whatever shape made the most satisfying narrative. It'll be a bigger story if we confirm it, he said. Bigger for a week, if we handle it right. She picked up a printed document from her desk. The PR firm drafted 3 options. I've already thrown out 2. She set it down again. The one I kept is a statement from both of us. Separate statements, not a joint one. Mine addresses the professional record and the timeline. Yours addresses the work and the terms of engagement. She looked at him. And we do 1 interview. Together. A journalist I trust who will let the story be told without turning it into something tabloid. He was quiet. That's a significant step, he said. I know. Once we do that, there's no version of events where this is a private thing anymore. There's no version of events where it's private anymore anyway, she said, and she was right. The choice isn't between private and public. The choice is between letting someone else tell our story or telling it ourselves. He thought about Lily. His first thought was always Lily, and he didn't apologize for that. My daughter, he said. She doesn't need to be mentioned. Children are off limits. I would not allow that. If someone finds out, I have a legal team who will make certain her name does not appear in any coverage. There are things I can't control in this situation, and there are things I can. She looked at him. Her name is something I can control. He believed her. That was the thing. Even in this, even in the middle of a situation that was partly her making, he believed her. She was not reckless with things that mattered. He rubbed the back of his neck. Let me read the statement. She slid the document across the desk. He read it. It was precise and unapologetic and true, a factual timeline of the professional engagement that made the sequence of events clear without being defensive about them. His own statement, which her team had drafted as a template he could revise, was clean and direct about the work and his terms of hire. He crossed out 4 lines, changed 2 others, and handed it back. She read his edits. She nodded once. The interview, he said. Who's the journalist? Her name is Marina Okonkwo. She covers business and culture for a national outlet. She's written about me twice, fairly, critically, both times. She's not looking for a takedown, and she's not looking for a puff piece. Vivian paused. She'll ask hard questions. I'd rather answer hard questions from someone honest than soft ones from someone who isn't. Ethan thought about this. He had never been the kind of person who sought the spotlight, had built a career specifically in the background of other people's brands. The idea of sitting in front of a journalist and being the story, rather than the person who shapes stories, made something in him tighten. I'm not good at talking about myself, he said. I know. That's why I'm not asking you to be charming. I'm asking you to be accurate. She looked at him. Tell the truth about the work. Tell the truth about the timeline. If she asks about us, don't perform and don't deflect. Just say what's true. He looked at the document in his hands. Okay, he said. Yeet. The interview was on a Friday, in a conference room that wasn't the main one, so smaller, less formal, chosen deliberately. Marina Okonkwo arrived with a recorder and no photographer, which Ethan noted and was grateful for. She was in her late 30s, precise in her questions, with the particular quality of a good interviewer. She made silence work, left space instead of filling it, which meant you had to be careful not to fill it yourself with things you hadn't meant to say. She asked Vivian about the timeline. Vivian laid it out without embellishment. The portfolio review, the restaurant, the Monday call. She was factual and completely steady, and if she felt anything about the exposure of it, she did not show it in a way that Marina could use. She asked Ethan about the work. He talked about the Hawthorne Collective. He talked about what he'd found in Charleston and what the Compass Rose had meant for the direction of the identity. He talked about the 11-year-old hunting lodge in Portland and why a brand could not be honest if it didn't understand the ground it stood on. He was not charming about any of it because he was not performing. He was just accurate, and accuracy turned out to be enough. Then Marina looked at them both and asked the question they'd both known was coming. When did the professional relationship become personal? Vivian said, late November, long after the work was established and the value of it was already demonstrable. Marina looked at Ethan. She's right about the timeline, he said. And for whatever it's worth, the work didn't change when things became personal. If anything, it got harder because we were both more invested in getting it right. He paused. I needed this project, not for financial reasons only, for the kind of reasons that are harder to explain. It mattered to me. And the person who trusted me with it mattered to me, and those things didn't compromise each other. They ran alongside each other. Marina was quiet for a moment after he said that. Then she wrote something down and asked her next question, and the interview moved on. The article ran 10 days later. It was long, 3,200 words, and it was fair in the specific way of good journalism. It presented facts and let them carry the weight. It asked hard questions and printed the answers. It did not pretend the situation was uncomplicated, but it also did not pretend the complication was scandal. Marina had titled it, The Brand That Told the Truth. The lead was about Mercer Hospitality's rebrand, the work itself, the scope of it, what it represented for the company's trajectory. The relationship came in midway through, framed correctly, with the timeline intact. It quoted Vivian on the professional record and Ethan on the work. It quoted the investor who had been skeptical of the timeline as being impressed by the consistency of the vision. It quoted Greg Harmon, which surprised Ethan, saying the creative direction had reset the standard for what the company communicated about itself. The anonymous gossip account posted nothing in response. The reshares slowed and stopped over 48 hours and were replaced by shares of the actual article. A senior editor at a hospitality trade publication wrote a piece about the rebrand that spent 2 paragraphs on the relationship and 8 on the work, which was the correct proportion. The investors held. The staff, for the most part, held too. There were some awkward days in the office, a few conversations that stopped when Ethan walked in that then resumed because there was work to do and the work was real, and you cannot sustain drama around a project that is genuinely absorbing. Priya came to his desk one morning and said, without preamble, I just want you to know the work has been the best I've ever been part of, and that doesn't change. He thanked her. She went back to her desk. Dale said nothing directly, but brought him a coffee one morning without being asked, which was Dale's version of a speech. Greg Harmon was harder. He was careful and professional and said the right things, but there was a quality to his interactions in the weeks after the article that was different. A careful distance, a slightly heightened formality that Ethan recognized as the behavior of someone recalibrating their position relative to a power structure that had shifted. It was not hostile. It was just honest in a way that Greg probably didn't mean to be transparent about. Ethan let it settle. Some things settled on their own if you gave them time and didn't prod them. The relationship itself developed in the specific way that real things develop, not smoothly, not cinematically, but in pieces that didn't always fit together on the first try. They were good in the work. That part was almost effortless, which should have been a warning of some kind but wasn't, because the easiness of the professional was in constant negotiation with the difficulty of everything else. She was, as she had warned him, bad at the soft parts. Not cold. He had understood early on that she was not cold, that the efficiency and the composure were a system she'd built for surviving the particular demands of her life rather than a reflection of what was underneath. But the system was old and well-practiced, and asking it to make room for something it hadn't accounted for was slow work. She forgot things that were not on a calendar. She went quiet for days when something at work was consuming her without thinking to say, I'm in a difficult stretch. Give me room. She asked for things indirectly when she should have asked for them directly, which was an irony given how direct she was in every professional context, but personal needs apparently lived in a different register. Ethan was not without his own complications. He was slow to speak when he should have been faster. He defaulted to solving things practically when the thing needed was just acknowledgement. He had a habit deeply ingrained of making himself smaller when he felt a conflict developing. Not disappearing exactly, but dimming, pulling back slightly, in the way of someone who had learned that being present sometimes meant being a target for grief. Nora had called it disappearing. She had not been wrong. There was a night in February when Vivian had canceled plans at the last minute because of a property crisis. A plumbing failure at the Denver site that was going to set the timeline back 3 weeks. And Ethan had said it was fine and meant it, mostly, but the mostly had come through in something in his voice that she'd heard. And 2 days later, she'd shown up at his apartment at 7:30 in the evening with takeout from the Thai place on his block that she'd remembered him mentioning once, 3 months ago. Lily had answered the door with him and stood looking up at Vivian with the total unfiltered appraisal of a 4-year-old encountering a new person. Vivian looked down at her. Something in her face changed, not dramatically, just a small adjustment, a recalibration, the way you adjust your whole self when you encounter something that is smaller and more real than you were prepared for. "Hi," Lily said. "Hi," said Vivian. "Why do you have food?" "Because your dad told me about this restaurant, and I wanted to try it." Lily considered this. "Did you try it?" "I haven't yet. I brought it here." "Oh," another long look. "My name is Lily." "I know. I'm Vivian." Lily turned and walked back into the apartment in the decisive way of someone who has gathered the necessary information and moved on. Over her shoulder, "Daddy, Vivian's here. Can she stay for dinner?" Ethan looked at Vivian, who was standing in the doorway with Thai takeout and an expression he had never seen on her before. Slightly thrown, slightly wide open. The armor not just loosened, but briefly off entirely. "She's something," Vivian said quietly. "Yeah," he said. "She really is." Vivian stayed for dinner. She sat at the kitchen table across from Lily, who cross-examined her with the methodical curiosity of a small person who has learned that adults reveal things if you ask the right questions. Did Vivian have a dog? No. Did she want one? She didn't know. What was her job? She had hotels. Were they big hotels? Some of them. Did the people who stayed in the hotels get to keep the little soaps? Vivian said yes. Generally, they were encouraged to. Lily said that was good because the little soaps were the best part. At one point, unprompted, Lily said, "My mom died." The table went quiet. Ethan watched Vivian hold the statement, but the way it arrived, flat and factual, the way only children can deliver information that adults circle for months. "I know," Vivian said. "I'm sorry." Lily looked at her with those clear, assessing eyes. "Do you have a mom?" "I did," Vivian said. "She died too, when I was not that much older than you." Lily processed this. She looked at her macaroni, the blue box kind which Ethan had made because it was a Tuesday and some things were constants. Then she looked back at Vivian. "That's really sad," Lily said, with such direct and unperformative compassion that Ethan had to look away briefly. "Yeah," Vivian said. Her voice was even, but something in it had shifted. It was. Lily reached over and patted Vivian's hand twice. I thought a gesture so like something an adult would do that it landed in the room like a small revelation, and then went back to her macaroni. Vivian looked at Ethan across the table. He met her eyes. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. After dinner, after Lily had been put to bed and the takeout containers cleared and the apartment had settled into its nighttime quiet, they sat on the couch and Vivian was more still than he had ever seen her. Not the controlled stillness of the office. Something else. Something that had been moved and hadn't entirely found its way back. "She's extraordinary," Vivian said. "She patted your hand." "I know." Pause. "I was not prepared for that." "Nobody ever is," he said. "She does it to people she decides have earned it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "What does she think about—" She gestured, meaning them. "This. She thinks you're interesting. Coming from a 4-year-old, that's significant endorsement." Vivian looked at the dark middle distance of his living room. "I want to be careful with her," she said. "I want to be good at this part. I don't have a reference point for it, and I know I'm going to get it wrong." She looked at him. "But I want to try to get it right." "That's all anyone does," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she leaned into him. Not dramatically, just slightly, enough that her shoulder was against his, and she stayed there without saying anything else. He thought about all the things that had been required to get to this specific moment. The 2-hour wait, the card on the counter, the Charleston walk, the Denver bar, the flight home over flat brown ground, the photograph in a gossip post and the article that replaced it with something true, the takeout container and the cross-examination of a 4-year-old. None of it had been clean, none of it had arrived in the right shape the first time. But it was real, all of it, every hard and imperfect and complicated piece of it. And real was what he had stopped believing he deserved, somewhere in the long, flat stretch after losing Nora. He had been wrong about that. He put his arm around her carefully, because some things needed to be done carefully. She didn't stiffen. She didn't manage it. She just allowed it, which was its own kind of statement from a person who did not allow things easily. Outside, Austin went on being itself. The traffic and the warm night and the particular quality of the city's light, that low amber that turned everything slightly golden after dark. Inside, the apartment held its breath around something small and essential, just like it always did, just like it always had. Except that now there were 2 people in the room, and the quiet was different for it. The Charleston property opened on a Thursday in late March, and the weather cooperated in the specific way that coastal spring sometimes does, warm without being heavy, the air carrying just enough salt to remind you where you were without overwhelming the senses. The kind of day that felt like it had been requested in advance by someone who knew what they needed. Ethan stood in the entry hall of what was now called the Meridian, a name that had come from the work, from the orientation concept, from the idea of a fixed point from which everything else is measured, and watched people walk through the door for the first time and do the thing he had been working toward for 8 months. They stopped, not dramatically, not with the gasping quality of theater, but with the small involuntary pause of people encountering a space that had made a decision about itself and committed to it fully. The compass rose from the original warehouse floor had been preserved under a panel of tempered glass, set flush with the new flooring, lit from below, visible to anyone who knew to look for it. Most guests would not know what it was or where it came from. They would feel it rather than read it, the sense of something genuine underneath the present, the sense of a place that had not invented itself from scratch, but had grown from what was already there. Vivian stood across the room watching the same thing Ethan was watching. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way of someone absorbing something they have been waiting a long time to see. She was dressed for the occasion without being formal about it. Clean lines, the same quiet authority she always carried, but something looser in her expression than there used to be. Something that hadn't been there a year ago when he had watched her eat alone at a restaurant table, like a person who had grown fully accustomed to her own company. He walked over. She heard him coming and said, without turning, "There." He looked where she was looking. A couple in their 60s, guests, not staff, here for the soft opening weekend, had stopped in the middle of the entry hall, and the man had his hand lightly on the woman's arm, and they were both looking up at the ceiling, where the original iron beams had been cleaned and left exposed, and where the late afternoon light came through the restored windows in long, amber-edged bars that moved slowly as the sun dropped. They were just looking, standing still in the middle of a room and looking at it the way you look at something when it gives you a feeling you weren't expecting. "That," Vivian said again, quietly. "Yeah," Ethan said. She turned to look at him. Her expression was the same one he had seen for the first time in his kitchen in February when Lily had patted her hand at the dinner table. That brief, unguarded openness, the armor not just loosened, but genuinely set down. She did not say "you did good work," or "this is what I hoped for," or any of the things that could have been said accurately. She just looked at him in a way that said she knew what this had cost, and she had watched him pay it, and she valued the thing that had been made. He understood by now that this was how she said the things that mattered. "Your grandmother would have liked it," he said. She looked at the compass rose under glass across the room. "She would have stood here for 20 minutes and told me the proportions of the entry ceiling were slightly off, and then admitted she was proud." A beat. "In that order." He laughed. It surprised her slightly. She always looked slightly surprised when he laughed at the right moment, as if she were still adjusting to being read correctly. He liked that. He liked being the person who could do that. The evening moved forward. There was a reception, investors and press, and a handful of carefully selected guests who had been chosen to be the first experience of the space. Vivian worked the room with the efficiency of long practice and the added quality of someone who had something real to talk about tonight, rather than just projections and plans. She could speak with authority about every detail of this building, not because she had memorized a fact sheet, but because she had been inside the decisions, had walked the space in every stage of its becoming, had argued about wallpaper and compass roses and ceiling heights, and the weight of history that a building carries whether you acknowledge it or not. Ethan moved through the evening differently. He was not a room worker, had never been, and the months with Mercer Hospitality had not changed that fundamental thing about him. He talked to the people who sought him out and listened carefully and deflected the more performative conversations with the gentle skill of someone who has learned how to be present without being consumed. He talked for 20 minutes with an architectural journalist who had questions about the material decisions, and the conversation was genuine and ran long and ended with the journalist saying she wanted to write about the project in depth, and could they arrange a follow-up, and he said yes and meant it. Marina Okonkwo was there. Vivian had invited her, which was the kind of deliberate decision Vivian made that looked casual from outside and was anything but. Marina found Ethan near the end of the evening and looked around the room and said, "You made something." "We made something," he said. She looked at him the way she had in the interview room, with that specific journalist quality of seeing a degree more than the surface. "You look different than you did in November," she said. "Different how?" She thought about it. "Like you stopped carrying something?" He considered this. It was accurate enough. "Still carrying plenty," he said. "Sure," she said, "but not the same things." He thought about that for a moment, what he had set down and what he had picked up, and how those were different weights, different shapes, different demands on the hands that held them. He thought about Lily at home tonight with Rachel, who had agreed to babysit and had called him 3 times in the past month to say in various constructions that she was relieved and happy and wanted to say "I told you so," but was choosing not to, mostly. He thought about Nora, not the waiting room, not the absence, the ordinary version, the tea with the bag still in, the directness, the way she had looked at him across their kitchen table in the early years and seen him clearly and not flinched at what she saw. He thought about how she would have looked at this room tonight with the amber light moving on the ceiling, and how she would have found the compass rose immediately and known what it meant. He missed her. That had not changed. It was possible, he had learned, to miss someone completely and also to be fully present in a life that was continuing. Those two things did not cancel each other out. They lived alongside each other, the way things do when they are both true. He had spent a long time believing otherwise. They drove back to Austin the next morning, Vivian and Ethan in her car, and somewhere on the long, flat stretch of highway with the low Texas landscape opening out on both sides, Vivian said, not looking at him, eyes on the road, "I want to ask you something." "Okay." "If I said I wanted more, not more of the project, more of the other thing, the Lily thing, the kitchen table on a Tuesday thing," she paused. "If I said I wanted that to be permanent, not a thing we're trying anymore, but a thing we've decided, would that scare you?" He looked at her profile. The set of her jaw, the particular quality of her attention, even when she was focused on driving. He had learned her in pieces over the months, the way she cleared her throat when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a while. She was clearing her throat now. "It would scare me a little lot," he said honestly. "Everything real is a little scary." "That's a non-answer." "It's the accurate answer." He looked out the windshield. The highway was long and straight, and the sun was behind them, which meant the road ahead was clear and well lit. "What are you actually asking, Vivian?" She was quiet for a moment. Her hand shifted on the wheel. "I bought a house," she said. He turned to look at her. 3 months ago," she said. "I've been living in an apartment since I moved to Austin. Corporate lease. Nothing personal about it." She glanced at him briefly and back at the road. "I bought a house in Tarrytown, 4 bedrooms, a yard. The kind of yard that would have a purpose if there were a child who needed somewhere to run." She paused. "I haven't told you because I was waiting to understand why I bought it, whether it was about me or about more than me." He sat with this for a moment. "You bought a house with a yard for a child you didn't have," he said. I bought a house with a yard, she said, because I was tired of living somewhere that didn't mean anything. And because I have a 4-year-old in my life who told me the little soaps are the best part and patted my hand at a kitchen table, and I realized I wanted to know her. She said it directly, the way she said things when they were most true. I wanted to know who she becomes. The highway ran ahead of them, straight and clear. That's, he started. I know it's a lot, she said. I know the math of what I'm describing. I'm not asking you to move in tomorrow. I'm not asking you to make a decision in a car on I-10. She paused. I'm asking whether it's a direction you want to move in. That's all. He looked at her. This woman who had driven 40 minutes on a Thursday night to tell the truth to a stranger in a restaurant, who had looked at his portfolio 3 times before she walked through the door, who had kept no photographs in her office because she had decided what the office was for, and who had allowed herself slowly and with great difficulty and occasional backsliding to decide what the rest of it could be for, who had sat at his kitchen table and received a 4-year-old's frank declaration about dead mothers without flinching, and who had been patted on the hand and let it land. Yes, he said, it's a direction I want to move in. She nodded once. She did not cry, because she was not someone who cried in cars on highways, probably, or at least not in front of people. But her hands on the wheel shifted again, and something in her shoulders released, and she drove the rest of the way home in the particular quality of silence that follows a thing you have been waiting a long time to say and have finally said. The house in Terrytown was on a street lined with live oaks that were old enough to have settled into the sidewalk, their roots lifting the concrete in slow, patient rebellion. The house itself was a 1940-something craftsman with a wide front porch and a backyard that was larger than it looked from the street, with a catalpa tree near the fence that was in bloom in early April and dropping white flowers onto the grass in a way that Lily, when she first saw it, described as snow but warm. They moved in on a Saturday in June, which was 4 months after the highway conversation and 3 weeks after Ethan had sat down with Lily and explained, as simply as he could, with the same respect for her intelligence that he always tried to bring to their conversations, that they were going to live somewhere new, that Vivian was going to be living there too, that it was going to be different from what they had now, but that the things that mattered, the blue box macaroni, Pelly the elephant, the Friday night movie ritual, the fact that he would always be there, none of that was changing. Lily had listened to all of this with the focused attention she brought to new information. Then she had said, "Does Vivian know about the macaroni rule?" He had said he would make sure she was informed. Lily had nodded, satisfied, and asked if she could have the room with the window that looked into the catalpa tree. She could. Moving day was not cinematic. Moving day was boxes and tired arguments about where the couch should go, and Lily getting underfoot in a way that was joyful and also genuinely impeding the movement of furniture, and Vivian, who had presumably managed 100 complex projects, discovering that the logistics of combining 2 households had a particular chaos that did not yield to management. She stood in the middle of the living room at 2 in the afternoon, surrounded by boxes, with a look on her face that was partly overwhelmed and partly something else. Present, Ethan thought, just fully present in the mess of it. Rachel showed up at 4 with food from the barbecue place 2 blocks over and sat on the porch and watched the chaos with the benevolent satisfaction of a person who had been right about something important and was finally allowed to enjoy it. She and Vivian had a careful, mutually respectful relationship that had developed over the months, 2 people who both loved Ethan in different ways and both had opinions and had worked out, gradually, how to share the space around him. "She's good," Rachel had told him a few weeks prior, in the specific tone of a sister who has been watching carefully and has reached a verdict. "She's hard work, but she's good." And then, "She looks at Lily like she's paying attention, not performing it, actually paying attention." But that had meant more to him than almost anything else anyone had said. The house became a home the way homes do. Not on moving day, not all at once, but in accumulation. A hook by the front door where Lily's backpack went every afternoon. Vivian's coffee mug that lived on the left side of the dish rack because that was where she always set it. The photograph Ethan framed and hung in the hallway. A print from Charleston, the compass rose under glass lit from below, that Vivian passed every morning and sometimes stopped to look at for half a second before continuing to the kitchen. The catalpa tree dropped flowers in June and went green through the summer, And Lily spent the better part of August conducting elaborate games in the yard that involved unclear rules and very specific requirements of anyone who wanted to participate, including Vivian, who participated on Lily's terms with the focused adaptability of someone who was learning a new skill and was not too proud to be bad at it initially. There was an afternoon in late August that Ethan kept coming back to afterward. He was at the kitchen table working. The Denver rollout was in final stages. Portland was finally moving. And he could hear the yard through the screen door. Lily's voice giving instructions with the absolute authority of a person who is both director and lead actor and has no patience for improvisation. And then Vivian's voice, lower, responding with the quality of someone who is genuinely listening rather than tolerating. And then Lily's laugh, the bell sound one, the real one, at something Vivian had said or done. He had stopped working. Just stopped and sat and listened to the sound of it. He had not known, when he sat down in linen and salt 16 months ago, that this was the shape of what was waiting. He had not known, when he drove home that night with a business card in his pocket, and the particular deflated feeling of a night that had failed in the most visible possible way, that failure was not what had happened. He had not understood yet that the empty chair had been doing something other than mocking him. He understood it now. Not as a tidy lesson, not as the kind of revelation that arrives with clarity and resolution. Life was not structured like that, and he had been around long enough to distrust the moments that felt too neat. But as a truth that had accumulated gradually, in pieces, the way the identity for groundwork had accumulated in his notebook late at night before it was ready to be a real thing, knowing where north is doesn't tell you where to go. It just means you can't pretend you're lost. He had been lost for a long time after Nora. Not dramatically, not in ways that were visible to everyone, but in the specific way of a person who has stopped believing that forward is a real direction. Who has made a very good peace with staying exactly where they are, because staying is survivable, and moving feels like it costs something that cannot be spent. The cost, it turned out, was not what he had thought. Portland opened in October of the following year, 18 months behind the original optimistic schedule and 3 months past the revised realistic one. And nobody who stood in the finished space would have known the difference between the timeline they'd planned and the timeline they'd lived, because the building felt like something that had arrived in its own time, rather than been delivered. The moss-covered roof had been preserved. The Douglas firs stood the way they had always stood, indifferent to the renovation and the delay and the infrastructure disaster and the permit fight and all the human scrambling that had happened at their feet. The building pressed itself into the ground the way it always had, and inside it felt like what it had always felt like. A place in the trees, quiet and specific, not trying to be anything other than where it was. Ethan stood on the access road in the October morning light and looked at the exterior for a long time. Vivian stood beside him with her hands in her pockets and her hair catching the wind that came through the tree line, and she was looking at it the same way she had looked at the Meridian on opening day, with the long patience of someone who has waited for something real and recognizes it when it arrives. "You said it right," she told him. "In the proposal, you said it should feel like you found it." "I had help with the concept," he said. She looked at him. "Your grandmother," he said, "knowing where north is." She was quiet for a moment, then, she would have hated the name. Too abstract for her. A pause. She would have loved the building. They stood there for a while. The trees moved. The light changed. A bird somewhere in the canopy made a sound that was the only sound. There were things, Ethan thought, that you spend years building without knowing that's what you're doing. The craft that accumulates in the hours when nobody is watching. The logo thrown away at midnight, the concept rebuilt from nothing because the first version was convenient rather than true. The eye trained over years to see what is false and what is found. He had been building that without knowing what it was for, without being certain anyone would ever ask for it. And there were other things. The life that assembles itself not from plan but from presence. From showing up to the Tuesday morning and the difficult conversation and the yard game played on a 4-year-old's terms and the moving day argument about the couch. From choosing the truth over the easier story again and again, even when the truth cost something. He was 34. He had a daughter who was nearly 6 and had recently become interested in drawing and had decided that her drawings were art projects and that they should be displayed on the refrigerator, and also, now that there was more refrigerator, on the walls of the hallway next to the Compass Rose photograph. He had agreed to both terms. He had a company. His name was on the door now, not a firm but his own entity, a small operation that Mercer Hospitality anchored and that was beginning to attract other clients who had read the Marino Conquo article or seen the Meridian's coverage, or simply found their way to his work the way clients occasionally did, through the grapevine of people who value the same things. He had kept Priya on retainer. Dale had followed of his own accord. They were a very small shop doing the kind of work that required patience and specificity and the willingness to throw things away, which meant they were not for everyone, which suited him. And he had Vivian. Difficult, brilliant, still bad at the soft parts in ways she was slowly and imperfectly improving, who still went quiet for days without warning, who still answered her phone at dinner sometimes when she shouldn't, who had once rescheduled Lily's school performance viewing for a vendor call and had then felt the weight of that mistake, not because Ethan had said anything, but because Lily had said with devastating simplicity, "It's okay, Vivian, I know you work a lot," and who had come home that evening quieter than usual and had sat on Lily's bed at bedtime and read her an extra 2 chapters without being asked, and had come out of the room with her jaw set and said to Ethan, without preamble, "I'm going to do better at that." He had said, "I know." And she had, not perfectly, not in a line, but in the accumulation of choices that constitute a person trying, which was all he had ever asked, all anyone could reasonably ask of another person who was carrying their own history and their own difficulty and their own hard-earned defenses. She proposed on a Sunday morning in November, the year after the Portland opening, not in a restaurant, not in a moment arranged for an audience. In the kitchen of the Terrytown house at 8:45 in the morning, when Ethan was making pancakes and Lily was at the table drawing something that she described, when asked, as a horse but with better legs, and the radio was on low and the catalpa tree in the yard had gone bare, and November gray, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of butter and batter. Vivian came downstairs later than she usually came downstairs because it was a Sunday, and she had, over the course of 2 years, learned to allow Sundays to be different from weekdays, which was a significant personal development, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them. Lily at the table with her crayons, Ethan at the stove with flour on his left forearm from the mixing, the radio, the warmth. She looked at it for a moment the way she had looked at the Meridian on opening night, with the long patience of someone who recognizes a thing she has waited for. She went to the counter. She opened the drawer that held the miscellaneous things, rubber bands, takeout menus, a small flashlight that Lily insisted needed to be accessible at all times, spare keys. She reached to the back of the drawer and came out with a small box that she set on the counter. Ethan turned around from the stove with the spatula in his hand. She looked at him. "I'm not good at speeches," she said. "You know that." "I know." "I'm good at decisions. I make a decision, and I commit to it, and I don't revisit it after the fact." She looked at the box and then at him. "I made this one a while ago. I was waiting for the right time, and then I realized I was doing the thing I do where I manage the moment instead of just being in it." She picked up the box and opened it toward him. A ring, simple, not elaborate, a design that was clean and meant it. "So I'm just being in it." Lily looked up from her drawing. Vivian did not look at her. She looked at Ethan. "Marry me," she said. Not a question, the way she said things when they were most true. He looked at her. This person who had sat down in the empty chair and changed the direction of his life with the absolute unpretentious certainty of someone who has done her research and made her decision. Who had told him she was bad at the soft parts before he found out for himself. Who had 4 photographs of her mother and had finally, after 2 years, put one of them in her office. Small, framed, set on the corner of her desk where she could see it from her chair. Who had bought a house with a yard before she let herself say why. Who had been patted on the hand by a 4-year-old at a kitchen table and had let it change her. The pancakes were going to burn. He turned off the burner. "Yes," he said. Lily, who had been following this with the focused attention of a child who understands that something significant is happening even if the full shape of it is not yet clear, looked at the ring box and then at Vivian and then at Ethan. "Does this mean Vivian is going to be here all the time?" she asked. "She already is all the time," Ethan said. Lily considered this. "Okay." She looked at her drawing. Can I be a flower person at the wedding? Vivian looked at her. The unguarded expression. The one Ethan had first seen in a hotel bar in Denver when Lily's name came up. The one that had become more frequent and less surprising over 2 years, but never entirely ordinary. You can be whatever you want, Vivian said. Flower person, Lily confirmed. With a basket, not one of those small ones. A real basket. A real basket, Vivian agreed. Lily went back to her horse with better legs. Ethan put the ring on and looked at his hand for a moment. The unfamiliar weight of it, the simple fact of it, and then looked at Vivian, who was still standing at the counter with the open box, watching him the way she had watched the people in the Meridian who had stopped in the entry hall and looked up at the ceiling and felt something they hadn't expected. The pancakes are ruined, he said. I'll make more, she said. You don't know how to make pancakes. I'll learn. She put the empty box back in the miscellaneous drawer next to the flashlight and the rubber bands and the spare keys. I learned things. He started the batter over. She stood beside him at the counter and watched him work with the particular focused attention she brought to things she was trying to understand, and Lily narrated her drawing from the table, and the radio played something from a station that nobody had chosen because the radio had been on for so long that it had become part of the room's ambient life. And outside the bare catalpa tree stood patient in its November gray, waiting for spring with the unhurried certainty of something that has done this before and knows the outcome. The wedding was in April when the catalpa would be blooming again, and Lily carried a basket, a real one, not a small one, and dropped white petals on a path that led to a ceremony surrounded by the people who had been present for the pieces of it. Rachel, who had been right and was permitted to say so, and said it warmly and only twice. Priya and Dale, who had been there for the work that was the beginning of everything. Marina Okonkwo, who came as a guest and not a journalist, and who looked at the room with the same quality of seeing she brought to everything. The investor who had wanted to accelerate the Portland timeline and had been told that concrete wasn't flexible, who had ultimately understood that Vivian's instincts were worth following even when they were inconvenient. Greg Harmon came. He and Ethan had reached the kind of détente that happens when two people work together long enough in close quarters to understand each other's limitations and decide the working relationship is worth maintaining anyway. Greg had loosened over 2 years some of the corporate language, still said aligned occasionally, but less reflexively, and once, at a production meeting, had said something genuinely funny that surprised the whole room, including himself. People grow, Ethan had found. Not dramatically, not in the ways the stories suggest, but in the small accumulated decisions of daily proximity to people who require them to be honest and present and occasionally better than they had planned. Lily dropped her petals with the seriousness of someone who has been given an important task and intends to execute it correctly. She was 6.5 now and had strong opinions about chapter books and had decided she wanted to learn to draw horses professionally, which she described as being an artist, with the flat certainty of someone who has made a career decision and does not expect it to be questioned. When the officiant asked Vivian if she took Ethan, the full name, the formal moment, she said I do with the same quality she said everything that was most true, directly, without ceremony, like a decision already made. When she asked Ethan, he said it back the same way. And that was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. Afterward, when the photographs were done and the dinner was running and the backyard of the Terrytown house was full of the sounds of people who had gathered around something real, Ethan stood at the edge of the yard near the catalpa tree and held a glass of something and looked at the life he was inside. Lily was across the yard with Rachel's youngest, running a game that appeared to involve the flower basket and a system of rules that changed when she was losing. Vivian was 20 feet away talking to the investor with the focused precision of someone who is at their own wedding, and also, quietly, still the CEO of a growing company, which was exactly who she was and not a contradiction. She glanced at him across the yard. A brief look, not lingering. Just a check. You're there, I'm here, we're both in this. And then back to the conversation. He raised his glass slightly. She turned back without changing her expression, but something at the corner of her mouth moved. He thought about the restaurant on 6th Street, the empty chair, the way the evening had arranged itself, Renee's absence, the long wait, the particular humiliation of being the man everyone had tried not to look at too directly. He thought about reaching for his coat and the chair scraping back, and a stranger sitting down in it with the ease of someone who had already decided where she belonged. He had been waiting for the wrong thing that night. He had thought the empty chair was a failure, evidence that nobody was coming, that the attempt had been wrong from the start, that moving forward was something he was not entitled to. He had sat with that belief for 2 hours and been ready to carry it home. But the chair had not been empty because nobody was coming. It had been empty because the right person wasn't there yet. This is the thing that doesn't fit on a greeting card and doesn't survive being said out loud at most dinner tables, but is true anyway. Loss does not have a schedule. Grief does not honor the timelines you set for it, and neither does whatever comes after. The life you build in the aftermath of losing someone is not a replacement for the life you had. It is a different life, carrying a different weight, asking different things of you. It does not erase what was. It is not required to. You are allowed to grieve and to continue. You are allowed to keep the photographs and fall in love and make more pancakes and get it wrong and try again. You are allowed to want things for yourself even when you're still carrying the missing. Ethan had needed a long time to believe that. He believed it now. Not because the hard things had resolved into ease. They hadn't. They wouldn't. Vivian would cancel plans and go quiet without warning, and they would have the same argument about the phone at dinner at least twice more in their lives. Lily would grow up and become her own full and complicated person with opinions Ethan hadn't anticipated and decisions he would worry about. The work would have good years and difficult ones. Portland would need a roof replacement within the decade. The world would do what the world does, which is continue being itself regardless of your plans for it. But the center of it was real. The house with the catalpa tree and the compass rose in the hallway and the miscellaneous drawer with the empty ring box that nobody had moved. The kitchen on Sunday mornings, the sound of Lily's laugh in the yard and Vivian's voice answering it. The empty chair had not been waiting for Renee. It had been waiting in the way that the right things wait. Not patiently, not impatiently, just there, present, holding a place for something that had not arrived yet but was already on its way. He finished his drink. He walked back toward the yard, toward the noise and the light, and the accumulated fact of the life he was building, piece by imperfect piece. The catalpa tree dropped a few white flowers onto the grass behind him. Nobody noticed. The flowers fell anyway. That was the whole story.